Hello students and welcome to chapter number 18. So this chapter talks about an important managerial function, and that is the last managerial function on our list, which is controlling. Remember, we had a set of managerial functions, and these were planning, organizing, leading, and controlling. So we have gone through all of the previous ones, and this is an entire chapter that is dedicated only to discussing the function of controlling activities and operations. So what is controlling, and why is controlling a very important function that managers need to undertake? Controlling is basically monitoring, comparing, and correcting performance. So regardless of how big the unit is, and even if, as a manager, your team and your department or your unit is functioning well and is achieving its goals and targets, without having a good process of controlling, without monitoring and comparing actual performance against desired performance, you will never know, whether or not you are achieving all of your targets and whether or not you are being efficient and effective in achieving those targets of yours. So the whole concept here is that we need to have a way of evaluating what's going on so that we can judge, so that we can assess whether or not we are moving in the right direction and whether or not we are, getting closer to achieving our targets and attaining our goals. So to answer the question, why is control so important? We need to think of all the efforts that the organization and the leaders and the managers put forth in order to plan what's going on for the business and what's going on in the workplace. So there is budgeting that's going on. An organizational structure is being created to facilitate performance. Managers are trying to motivate their workers, and a lot of other things are taking place to ensure that the business is achieving its targets. However, without proper controls, without a proper way of assessing, evaluating, and reviewing whether or not performance was effective, you will never know whether all of those things that you have undertaken are actually getting you closer to your targets. So your planning that you spend a lot of time and effort and money on is not going to be fruitful unless you have proper controls in place. And the second reason is employee empowerment. So we have talked about this concept before. So empowering employees, meaning giving them the power. We have discussed how many managers are reluctant, are not very much motivated to give their employees the authority to make some decisions. Why is that the case? Because they are afraid that they are going to do mistakes, and the managers are the ones who are going to be held responsible for those mistakes. But when for proper control, we do need to relinquish some of this control and some of this decision making to employees, because they are the ones who are in the field. And when we have seen in the chapter of motivation how when we involve people in decision making, when we let them feel that their input is valuable, they would be more accepting of the targets, and they would be more motivated to work towards attaining them. And the last thing is that planning is important because control is important because managers are responsible for protecting the workplace. Protecting the workplace against so many things, against financial scandals, against violence, against national disasters, against terrorist attacks, from all types of dangers. They are the ones who need to have policies in place. They need to have procedures for risk management and crisis management, and this is all part of their function as managers, which is under the umbrella of control and monitoring. Without having proper procedures like these, then employees are not going to be protected, and the entire organization is in jeopardy. So this is an exhibit that summarizes all, the managerial functions: planning, organizing, leading, and controlling. Remember in chapter number 2, for example, when we talked about the process of decision making, how we, just because we have made a decision, it doesn't mean that the process or the cycle ends there. We have to go back and evaluate. So this is exactly what's happening over here. This is controlling. We don't stop once we are done. We have to go back and evaluate and assess and measure whether or not everything is being done correctly. And if things are going well, then why are they going well? How can we improve them even further? And if they are not going well, what are the reasons, and how can we avoid these problems in the future? So this is why controlling is very important. And here is a description of the control process. So what the control process is all about, it's a 3-step process where we begin with measuring actual performance. So evaluating what's actually happening on the field, for example. And then we compare that performance that we just measured against standards that are already in place. So what our targets are. So this is where we compare actual performance against. And then finally, we take corrective actions. So in case there are any problems, in case there are any deviations from our plans, then we take actions to rectify this situation. So this is how important the process of controlling is all about. This is how managers know whether or not they are making the right decisions and whether or not those decisions are actually right. So the control process also assumes that there are standards in place, because we are going to compare actual performance against some existing standards. So those standards could be the targets that we are working towards achieving. So this assumption is actually correct, because we always have targets that we want to achieve, but whether or not those targets are clear and timely and realistic, this is an entirely different process, an entirely different issue. But the control process is all about measuring what's going on, comparing it against what we want it to look like, and then finally taking corrective actions. So this is a good illustration of what the control process is all about and what does it consist of. It consists of those 3 steps. So what is at the center of all of those steps? Achieving the goals and objectives of the organization or the division or the department, or even individual goals and objectives. So why are we taking all of those steps? Why are we measuring actual performance, comparing it, and then taking corrective managerial actions? The whole point behind this is that we want to ensure that the goals and targets and objectives are being achieved and are being accomplished according to our time frame. Let us begin our discussion of each and every step. So when we measure actual performance, we have a couple of things that we need to keep in mind. So the first one is how we measure. So what kind of methods do we use as managers and as people who will work later on as professionals in order to measure exactly what kind of methodologies are we going to use? There are plenty of methods available, typically for our most common, for managers specifically. The first one could be personal observations. So this is when managers observe what's going on in the field by themselves. The second one could be statistical reports. So statistical analyses of what's going on. So this is when you get lots of numbers and bar charts and pie charts to see what's going on in statistically. Then we have oral reports. So this is during meetings, for example, when workers come from different units to report what's going on and to deliver presentations on the performance of their units. And finally, written reports. So typically there are regular reports that are being provided to managers on a regular basis. So things like weekly reports, monthly reports, quarterly reports, annual or yearly reports, and so on. So based on these types of reports, people and managers have these different methods of measuring what's going on in their units, divisions, or the entire organization even. The second point that we need to keep in mind is what is being measured. So how? It's about the methods that we use. So we have all of those different types of reports, and of course each and every one has its own advantages and disadvantages. But what is actually even more important is what we measure, what is being measured, because sometimes when we select the wrong criteria, we end up making the wrong decision. And we have seen that in chapter number 2 when we talked about the process of decision making. Selecting a good criteria is definitely the cornerstone of ensuring that all these things are being effective. And this is why managers need to be very careful when it comes to selecting the criteria that they use for measuring actual performance. Typically speaking, they will try their best to select objective criteria. So numbers and indicators of what's going on. You have probably heard this term a lot of times already in this course or in other courses, something that is referred to as KPIs, key performance indicators. So these are numbers or statistics that reflect certain measures. So this is an objective type of criteria where it just reflects the reality of the situation. However, sometimes when these are unavailable or difficult to develop, then managers would also use subjective criteria. So even though they have their limitations, subjective criteria, meaning that their interpretation is different from one person to another, still having subjective criteria is better than having no criteria at all. So these are the 4 methods of, the methods that managers can use for measuring actual performance. So we have personal observations, statistical reports, and then oral and written reports. So as we mentioned, each and every one has its own advantages and disadvantages. They have their own pros and cons. So in order to be most effective, managers use a combination. So they don't just focus on one type of method, they use a combination of all of those 4 different types of reports. So they would have regular meetings, so those are oral reports. They would also request their employees and different divisions and units to submit written reports. They would also have statistical reports, and they would go to the field themselves and observe what's going on. The concept here is that there are different methods to be used. The important aspect is that we need to use a combination so that we get a better angle, a better view of what's happening. So the second step in the control process was comparing actual performance against the standard. So in this process, what we are doing is that we have already selected the methods, we have already selected the criteria that we are going to use, and now we are going to compare the numbers. Compare the numbers of what's actually happening and what should happen, what we like things to be. So this is why the concept of ensuring and determining an acceptable parameter of variance between the two is very critical, because when can we say that this is considered okay and this is considered not okay? Let's take an example. So we have, for example, determined that the target that we want to achieve in our company is that we want to produce 50 mobile phones per hour. So just consider this a target. We want to produce 50 mobile phones per hour. And now so this is our target, or this is our standard. So let's measure actual performance. When we measure actual performance, we find that we are producing 49 mobiles per hour. So it means that there is a difference. So now we need to determine, is this difference, is this variation, is this discrepancy, is it considered okay, an acceptable kind of difference or not? When do we say that this is acceptable and this is not? This is an important conversation that decision makers in the organization must make, because they need to determine when can we say that this is still considered okay, because no matter what, variations will arise. It is considered an inevitable and an inescapable type of situation that variations and differences in performance will exist. But when can we say, and when do we say, that this variation and this difference is acceptable, but that variation and that difference is not acceptable? This is what is known as the range of variation. This is an illustration of the concept that we just discussed. So we will have variations of performance. So either more or less of what we planned. So in our previous example, we said that the target, the standard, was 50 mobile phones per hour. And now we are producing less, 49 or 48 or 30. So this is lower than what we had already planned. So is this considered acceptable or not? This is what we are trying to determine. And sometimes the variation is about producing more. So what if we are producing more, 51, 58, 60 something? Is this considered acceptable? Up to which level do we say that this is still acceptable and now this is not acceptable? If you were wondering, so what if we are doing more? Doesn't that mean that we are actually more effective and we are doing very well? Not necessarily, because this could happen on the expense of quality. When you are producing a lot more than what you had already planned, it could mean that maybe you're not paying attention to detail and you are producing mobile phones that are defective. So this is why you need to ensure that what's actually going on reflects a good range of variation. Step number 3 in our control process is taking managerial action. So now that we have measured actual performance, we have compared actual performance against the standards that are already established, now it is time to make a decision. So the decision that managers could take falls under one of two options. One, correcting actual performance, and two is revising the standard. So when it comes to correcting actual performance, we also have a number of different options that managers have. So they could decide on immediate corrective action. What that means is that managers here are just going to correct the problem at once, and their objective here is to get performance back on track. So making sure that if all operations are resumed back to normal and that now we are working towards achieving our goal. The second option is basic corrective action, and in this case managers are trying to find the original source of the problem, and they will fix the source of the issue. So in here there's a quality term known as root cause analysis, finding out the actual source of the problem and going and correcting the source of the issue rather than the issue itself. So going back to the origin and making sure that the actual cause of this issue is being addressed. So this is one big option in this step, which is correcting actual performance. So this is one decision. Another decision is revising the standard. So the decision here could be not correcting the performance, but maybe the performance is fine. What is actually wrong is the standard itself. So when we try to take actions to correct the problem, one of the things that we can find is that maybe the standard that we set was either too easy or too difficult. So in this case, we need to revise the standard. We need to review our goals and making sure that we are setting realistic goals. We have often mentioned, even in the chapter of motivation, that goals need to be realistic. At the same time, they shouldn't be too easy. Otherwise, they will not be motivating enough for people to work towards achieving. Why are they not motivating enough? Because they're not challenging enough, and without a proper amount of challenge, people are not going to feel satisfied. Why? Because they're not going to feel that what they did was an actual achievement, because everyone could have done it. So we need to be careful when it comes to reviewing our standards. We need to see, was the target too high? Was it too low? There's an important word of caution here to managers, that they need to be very careful when it comes to revising standards downward, because it might send a negative message to employees. What we mean by this is that when you tell your employees that, okay, do not produce 50 mobile phones per hour anymore, just produce 30. Now maybe employees will think that, oh, we have been doing a great job, and they could start slacking off. So you need to communicate why. You need to communicate a very good message on how and why these standards are reviewed. So to take a step back, let's review the different varieties of managerial decisions in controlling. So in step number 3, what are the options that are available to managers? What can they do after they have measured actual performance and compared it against a standard? So now they find that there is a variation, and a non-acceptable variation. So their options are the following. They can do nothing. Maybe they find that no, everything is actually going well. The second option is that they can correct the performance, and we have seen that this can be either immediate or basic. And then finally, they could actually review the standard itself. Maybe they have set an unrealistic standard or an unchallenging one. So these are the different options available to managers. Each and every one has its own, pros and cons. Managers need to be very careful, and they need to study why, why each decision and where each decision should be applied in under which circumstances. And here is a very helpful process flow chart, or a workflow chart for managerial decisions in the control process. So we begin at the left-hand side with the objectives. So we have our objectives, we have determined them, and then we have also determined our standards, and then we go to step number 1, and that is measuring actual performance. And then we go upward, we follow the flow, and then we compare actual performance against the standard. And then we ask ourselves all of these questions. If the standard is being attained, if the goals are being achieved, then we can do nothing. And then we go back and start the cycle all over again. If no, the standards are not being achieved, then we need to determine, is the range of variation acceptable or not? If yes, then we don't have a problem, and the cycle goes back and start all over again. But if the variance is not acceptable, then we need to see, is the standard acceptable? Is the standard effective? Is it too high? Is it too low? if the standard is acceptable and it's not being met, then we need to identify the cause. We need to find out what's happening and correct the performance. If no, then if the standard is not acceptable, then we need to revise the standard itself. So, and the process and the cycle starts all over again. We measure actual performance again, we compare it against the standard, and we ask ourselves all of these questions all over again. So it's a continuing, it's an ongoing process. So this is a nice, helpful process flow chart that managers can use as a guiding map for making decisions in the control process. So we have mentioned the term performance so many times already throughout this chapter. When we said, for example, measuring actual performance. So what is performance? Performance is the end result of an activity. So an activity on the job could be, undertaking job responsibilities as effectively as possible. So what is the end result of that? What have you delivered? So this is your performance. In that context, organizational performance is the accumulated, the aggregated result of all of the organization's work activities. So what did Unit A do? What did Unit B do? What did that department do? What did that individual do? And then we accumulate. We put all of those performances together and we have the performance of the entire organization. And this is where we can say and measure that the performance of the entire organization, was it successful, was it effective, was it efficient, or was it not? So to measure organizational performance, we have a number of parameters that we can use. And one of them is productivity. And productivity is basically, output over input. So what do we mean by output? So output is things like the goods or services that you are providing. So the goods that you sell or the services that you provide. And you divide that by the amount of input that you require to generate, to produce this output. So let's take an example. So when we talk about output, let's talk about, for example, mobile phones. If you are a company that manufactures mobile phones, so your productivity can be measured as follows. How many mobile phones do you sell? How many mobile phones do you sell or do you manufacture? Do you produce? You divide that by the amount of input that you require to produce these mobile phones. So things like how many hours have you worked in order to produce that many mobile phones? How much money did you spend on producing those mobile phones? So this is how you measure your productivity. You can have different numbers here. So things like the number of goods sold, you could have the revenue generated by selling these units. So when we say revenue, we mean, what is the price per unit, for example, and you multiply that price per unit times all the units that you sell. So this is the amount of money that you generated, and you divide the amount of money that you received on the amount of money that you spent, and then you get your productivity, for example. Another parameter is what is known as organizational effectiveness. This is an extremely important parameter that managers use to determine, the effectiveness of their organization in general. And what that means is that they determine, using this parameter, they determine how appropriate the goals were and like how well those goals are being achieved. Remember when we differentiated between effectiveness and efficiency. So remember those definitions. So how good are we in meeting our objectives? So even though we could be meeting our objectives, maybe we are spending a lot of time or a lot of money than planned. So For example, set a budget of $100 million. So this is the amount of money that we want to spend on producing, for example, 1 billion mobile phones. And then we produced 1 billion mobile phones, but we exceeded our budget by so much. Can we say, oh, we achieved the target, then we are effective and we are productive and everything is well? We cannot say that, because even though we achieved the target, we weren't effective. We weren't effective in achieving that target. We weren't very efficient, meaning we have exceeded the budget by so much. So productivity is a very important parameter that managers use. It's the amount of output divided by the amount of input. And organizational effectiveness is how good were you in achieving those objectives. When we talk about employee performance in the context of controlling, managers have to take sometimes the hard decision of implementing a disciplinary action. And what that means is that, sometimes managers have to enforce the standards and the regulations of the organization, even if that means that certain employees must be punished or must, suffer some sort of consequence for their actions. And this falls under the concept of feedback. We have talked about feedback in previous chapters. We have discussed how feedback is important, because without feedback, as an employee, you will not know how well you are doing and whether or not you need actually to do something to, correct your performance. And this is the whole idea of controlling. It's all about correcting performance. But if the manager is not talking with you about your performance and is not giving you feedback, is not giving you information on whether or not you did well, then you will never know if what you are working towards is actually what the manager wants. So sometimes managers have to ensure that the regulations of the organization and of work standards are being met. And if they are not being met, they have to take corrective actions, and these are referred to as disciplinary actions, ensuring that and enforcing those standards even on employees. Another more contemporary type of concept is what is known as progressive disciplinary action. And this is a concept that says that the minimum penalty appropriate to the offense is imposed. So making sure progressive disciplinary action is about making sure that the minimum punishment, the minimum penalty is actually being implemented. That, no deviation and no offense, no violation is being unpunished. No violation is being unaddressed. This is what progressive disciplinary action is all about. That at least the minimum punishment, at least the minimum penalty is being imposed. So here are some of the types of problems that we are talking about that managers sometimes need to address. So problems of performance, for example. So let's talk about attendance. So an example of some of those problems that arise on the part of employees are things like absenteeism. So basically when people do not show up for work, or tardiness, meaning being late, or the abuse of sick leaves, when they basically falsify sick leaves and pretend that they are sick and they do not show up for work. So this is a problem. This is a deviation from standards that we need to impose. So in case employees do this, then managers must take disciplinary action. They must punish this type of behavior. And when we say punish, let's not only focus on the negative aspect of it. It's not punishing, for personal reasons. It's correcting performance. The point of imposing a penalty or imposing a punishment in the context of organizations is it's all about making sure that the standards are being followed, that the regulations and the policies and the rules of the company are being followed. And we need to send a message to everyone in the company that these standards are in fact being imposed and are in fact being followed and are in fact being focused on by management. So as a manager, you need to ensure that you are following the policies as well. So you cannot just punish someone for being absent. You need to go back to the procedures and the regulations of the company in case someone is being absent. So what is the procedure here? You need to go back to the procedure of the company. Other examples include things like on-the-job behavior, so things like insubordination. So when employees disobey and basically do not follow the instructions of their managers. So this is a problem. How do we punish it? How do we punish it? We go back to the procedures of the company. What does the company say about this? Or things like failure to use safety devices, things like consuming alcohol or drugs on the location of the company. How do we punish this? Of course, this is something that must be addressed. Otherwise, this is not going to create a safe culture for our employees. Remember that one of the reasons for controlling is that we need to create a safe work environment. So we need to protect our employees and our workers against threats like this. Another problem is dishonesty, for example. So theft and lying and falsifying important information. When employees are being dishonest and showing these types of behaviors, what can we do? So this is not a judgment that supervisors and managers must take arbitrarily. They need to go back to the book of regulations and review the policies of the company. This is what controlling is all about. And finally, things like outside activities. So criminal activities outside of the company, working for a competing organization in case this is something in their contract. If employees violate these agreements between them and the company, first of all, this is something that must not go unaddressed, and then we need to go back and see how can we enforce the regulations of the company in a good way. In a good way meaning in a way that improves performance. So within the idea of feedback, we have different types of controls that could take place in relation to feedback. So the first type of variety is what is known as feed-forward control. So feed-forward control is control that takes place before an activity is done. So the goal here is to prevent a problem before it happens. So this is when managers correct performance or correct standards before the activity is completed, before the performance is done. And the advantage here is that we stop the problem from happening before it even occurs, so that we avoid any loss, we avoid any damage for example, in our products or the services that are offered. So that's why feed-forward control is sometimes preferred, because it prevents the problem before it even happens. The second option is concurrent control. And as the name implies, concurrent means that two things are taking place. So the performance is actually happening right now, and then control is also happening at the same time. So this is when managers are directly observing what's going on, and they give immediate feedback on what's happening to their employees on their performance, and they correct the performance right there on the field. Another term for this is what is known as MWA, or management by walking around. So this is when managers are cruising in the work area, and they are interacting directly with their employees, they are observing their performance, and they are giving them advice and feedback immediately on their performance, and they are correcting any issues right there on the field. Of course, advantages is that before a problem gets bigger, we correct it, and we stop the problem from becoming something that goes beyond our control. The final type of option is feedback control. So this is when control takes place after the activity is done. So after the employees have delivered their performance, we give them feedback, we evaluate their performance. So we have, of course, this is probably the most common type of feedback. Things like the annual performance appraisal is an example of this. So this is when the performance is already completed, when the performance has taken place, and then we evaluate it and we give feedback on it. So this provides us with lots of good benefits. One of them is it shows managers and it tells them whether or not their planning efforts were actually on target. What that means is the following. So before our employees perform their jobs, we have given them instructions, we have planned a lot of things, we have set budgets, we have determined how work is going to be distributed. So we let them do the job. When they do it, if they did it very well, then it means that our planning and our instructions were actually very good. So that's one great benefit of feedback control. And then another benefit of feedback control is that people like to be appreciated, and people like to hear praise, and they like their efforts to be recognized. And this can happen at this stage. So once they have completed their performance, and now we can measure it, and if they did a good job, we acknowledge that and we tell them, you have done great, you are the best worker in this unit, and so on. So this acts as a motivating type of process for employees. So feed forward, this is when we stop the problem from even happening in the first place. Concurrent control, or management by walking around, is when we observe the performance and correct it on the spot. And then feedback control is when the performance is done and then we give information on it. To summarize the types of control that we just discussed, here is a nice looking exhibit and illustration of what that means. So the feed forward control, it's all about preventing problems before they occur. So we focus here on the input. So on the input part of production. So before something happens. And then concurrent controls, it's all about correcting problems as they happen. So immediately, we correct the problem, and we focus here on the processes. And finally, feedback control, it's about the output. So we look at the output and we give feedback to our employees on their performance. So for each and every one of those controls, there are definitely benefits. There are definitely, sometimes cons, depending on how early on you want to detect the problem. The whole idea here is that controls are important and they can be used during each and every step of the way. An essential type of control in any business is, of course, financial control. The ultimate goal of any business is to become profitable, is to make money. So we need to measure those standards, and we need to have some controls to see whether or not our business, our organization, our unit is actually performing well financially. So in this context, we use different types of ratios, things like liquidity, profitability, leverage, and so on. You will study those in detail in future courses, hopefully, like financial management. But the whole idea that you need to learn here is that we need to employ these types of financial controls and ratios to measure the effectiveness of our business financially, to see whether we are achieving those financial targets of ours, to see whether or not, we are making enough money to pay our expenses and to even have some profits, to make sure that our debt levels, the loans that we take, our debt levels are not too high. So this is why these financial ratios are important, because they reflect the performance of the financial aspect of the business. Another aspect here is the budget. All organizations have budgets. Each and every unit has its own budget. So we use budget in both planning and in also controlling. Budgets are a planning tool because, while we determine this budget, while we work on this budget, we identify the important work activities, we determine the significant contributions that each and every unit is going to make. So this is the planning part of, or the planning use of the budget. It's also a controlling tool because we use it to see, to compare actual performance against the standard. So the budget provides us with a good way of measuring performance and making sure that we are not deviating too far from the budget, and whether or not expenses are too high, and these high expenses are not generating enough revenue. So this is an important function, an important aspect for managers to learn. They need to be able to interpret the financial data, and they need to be able to conduct some sort of analysis to really, capture the picture of what's going on financially in their business. Some of the most commonly used financial ratios are the ones that you can see here on this table. So liquidity, leverage, activity, and profitability. These are all important financial ratios that managers must learn. Even if those managers are engineers, even if those managers are, they work in marketing, they do not have to be people who specialize in finance or who work in the accounting department to know these things. The managers from all types of fields, from different backgrounds, they must have a good understanding of these financial ratios, because they are the ones in charge of taking corrective actions, and they are the ones in charge of explaining these information to their bosses. So they must know some sort of information about reading those financial statements. Here's a nice explanation of what those mean for you as freshman students. You just need to take a good idea of why financial ratios are important, what are some of the things that they reflect. I'm sure that you are going to study these in greater details in your future courses. Control is all about collecting information and using this information to make decisions. So for managers and for organizations, an MIS is being used. And I know that many of you, my students, are students who are studying a bachelor's degree in management information system. So what is a management information system? It's a system that provides management, that provide decision makers with the needed information on a regular basis. So we mentioned that managers, they need information on a regular basis. They need information every day. They need information every week, every month, every quarter, every year to review the performance of their units and of the entire organization. So the word system or the term system over here, we're not necessarily talking about a computer software. We're just talking about an ordered type of procedure that generates this information. And take note that we are talking about information, not raw data. You will study this, I'm sure, in other courses in information technology or principles of MIS. So the difference and the distinction between data and information. Data are raw. They are, mere numbers. They need to be processed. They need to be analyzed so that they mean something. Once that is done, then we can call them information. What managers need are information. What managers need is information. They need to, have something of value that they can use and interpret to make decisions. So, generally speaking, this system, this MIS, this Management Information System, in most of the companies nowadays, it is definitely a computer-based system. Some companies have developed their own in-house systems. Some have used some of the most, commercially popular ones. What you need to keep in mind here is that there must be some sort of systematic way, an organized way of collecting data from different sources on a regular basis, analyzing this data, and producing information that management can use to understand what's going on in the organization and base their decisions upon them. We have talked about financial controls, and we have said that financial controls are definitely important and that managers must use and understand these financial controls so that they can make good decisions regarding the effectiveness of their units. But what happens sometimes is that managers get too invested in these financial ratios, in these financial information, that they overlook some of the other very important aspects of the process. So in order to perform something in the organization, in order for you to achieve your objectives, yes, you need a budget. So this is a financial part of the financial part of the process, but you also need people. So sometimes managers overlook this part. So this is why this tool called the Balanced Scorecard, this is a very important tool that managers can use in order to make decisions that look at 4 different areas rather than merely focusing and only focusing on the financial perspective. So the Balanced Scorecard encourages managers to focus on, yes, the financial part. This is definitely a very big part of it, but also it pushes managers and decision makers to evaluate the people part. So things like innovation and growth assets. So to see whether or not we have the right people, whether or not we need more people, for example, whether or not these people need to be trained. So that's another area in the Balanced Scorecard. The third area is the internal processes. So the procedures that we have in place within the organization. So whether or not, the work procedures that we have and the processes that we have internally, are they supportive of achieving those financial ratios and achieving the overall targets of the company in general. And the fourth aspect of the Balanced Scorecard is the customer. So everything, we said that the ultimate goal of any business is to generate money. Who is going to pay us that money? The customers, of course. So we need to evaluate the effect of our decisions on the customer and whether or not, the controls that we put in place affect the customer positively and improve the customer experience, and gets us more share in the market. So the balanced scorecard focuses on 4 different areas, and it pushes managers to not only focus on the financial perspective, but to also look at and consider other important aspects as well. We cannot talk about controls without mentioning benchmarking. So benchmarking is an important performance measurement tool, and it looks at more than just the financial perspective. So when we say benchmarking, we mean that we make a comparison between our organization and the best practices in the field, the best organizations in the field. So we are trying to come up with benchmarks. When we say benchmarks, we mean standards of excellence that we will use to compare, to use for measurement and comparison. So let's say that we are a petrochemical company, and maybe the best in the field is SABIC. So let's compare what we do against what SABIC does. So what do we compare exactly? Those are the standards, those are the benchmarks that we need to select. Those are the standards of excellence. So SABIC is excellent in terms of what? In terms of how they train their employees, for example, in terms of how they do their planning and budgeting activities. So these are the standards that we will use, and we will compare ourselves against SABIC in terms of those excellence standards. This is why benchmarking is important, because it pushes you to improve, and it shows you, how and why other organizations are successful. While it's a very good idea to compare your organization against other organizations, meaning against external parties, it's also a very good idea to do some internal analysis, to look at what's going on very well within your organization. Your organization consists of different divisions, different units, different departments, different sections, different teams. So each and every organization has, each and every one of those units has its own way of doing things. Okay, so it might be a very good idea to do some comparison between the different units within the organization and find out the best practices within your company, inside your organization. So here are some suggestions for what is called internal bookmarking. So this is when you compare, best practices, but not outside, actually inside the organization. For example, you can try to connect best practices to strategies and goals. So everything stems from the company's mission and vision and goals and values. So how people and how units should work within the company should be linked ultimately to the strategies and the goals of the organization. So try to establish that connection. Then in number 2, try to identify best practices throughout the organization. So look at all of the different units, all of the different divisions, and see which unit particularly stands out. What do they do very well? There are different processes and functions that are shared and common across all the different units. So look at which unit is doing something very well and try to encourage other units to follow their lead. Develop best practices reward and recognition systems. So you encourage your units and your teams to go the extra mile and to do something very well. And when they know that these efforts are going to be rewarded and recognized, they are going to be more motivated, and they are going to feel that this is something of value to them. Communicate those best practices throughout the organization. So this is when organizations let other units know about the work of a certain unit. So this is when they say that, the human resources department, for example, is one of the best units within our company. Why? Because they do these things very well. So they share this information with the other parts of the company. Create a best practice knowledge sharing system. So have a systematic way, have a formal mechanism where, members of the organization, where employees are sharing those information, are sharing those experiences, so that you encourage them to talk to each other, not just in a friendly and social manner. It should be something systematic. And finally, foster and nurture best practices on an ongoing basis. So encourage your employees to do something, to do those types of things on a regular basis, not a one-shot mentality. It's not a yearly event. This is something that should be going on a regular basis. And you create a culture this way where you foster learning and knowledge sharing. In the field of business, we always talk about globalization and how organizations nowadays are infiltrating the global market. And we have seen how, uh, moving across cultures is a very challenging process for managers, because what is considered acceptable in a certain place is not necessarily considered that acceptable in others. But the mere point of the mere fact that you have operations in different parts of the world definitely creates a challenge for managers in terms of controlling the idea that, the fact that there is a great distance. This creates the need for more formalized controls like reports. The fact that, SABIC, for example, has operations in Vietnam. So how can the manager at Saudi Arabia here in SABIC control and monitor what's going on in the plant in Vietnam? It means that he or she is going to rely on the reports that are submitted by the team in Vietnam. So because of the distance, this is maybe the only option available. He cannot go, himself or herself and, directly observe what's going on. So they would rely more and more on formalized controls. The impact of technology is something that is definitely, takes place in the process of controlling across cultures. So in more technologically advanced countries, managers are going to rely on those reports that are submitted electronically. They are going to, they will have the opportunity, for example, for direct observation, using different online systems. But in less technologically advanced countries and cultures, managers are going to face a challenge, and they would rely on different types of controls. Now, local laws also have an important role to play here. Sometimes, the laws in a certain country prohibits and prevents companies from bringing in a management team from outside. In certain countries, the managerial levels are preserved for nationals only. So this is why here controls can be, a bit of a challenge. And then comparability issues could also arise. When we say comparability, so the extent to which the data that we collect across the two locations can actually be compared. So labor costs, for example, in China are so different from labor costs in Saudi Arabia. So if we have a plant here and a plant there, does this, piece of data, is this something that is comparable across the two locations? How is labor cost calculated in Saudi Arabia, and how is labor cost calculated in China? This is what we mean by comparability. Sometimes the two do not cannot be compared. And then finally, you need to be prepared for any emergencies, for any disasters, for any turmoil, for any disturbances. I mean, the fact that you are operating in different locations across the globe means that you are being more exposed to different types of risks. So you need to have proper procedures, proper controls in place, and you need to plan very rigorously when it comes to how you are going to respond in the case of an emergency, in the case of a problem, of a disaster. So managing and controlling cross-cultural differences is definitely a big challenge for managers, and they must take that into consideration when developing their controls and their standards. The issue of workplace privacy is being more and more discussed because employees sometimes feel that their privacy is being violated. But at the other hand, employers and organizations, they have also their reasons for monitoring what you consider private property. So employers and managers have the right to read your email and have the right to listen to your phone calls and have the right to store and review your computer files. And why is that the case? Why do managers have this right? And why do organizations do all of these things? Well, they want to monitor your productivity. They want to see how much time you are actually spending working and how much time you are spending on Facebook and YouTube. This is their right. You are here from 7 o'clock to 4 o'clock and you are being paid to perform work activities. We are not paying you to spend time reading newspapers and updating your Facebook status. And companies also have concerns about offensive and inappropriate material. It has been, a case a number of times in different organizations where employees misuse the internet, for example, where they, find offensive material online using the company's internet connection. And this is definitely a big issue for organizations. They need to ensure that employees are not misusing the resources available to them. And then finally, organizations monitor all of those things. They monitor your email and your phone calls because they want to protect their secrets. They want to protect their confidential information. Sometimes when employees are not being careful, they could, leak very sensitive information that could result in a big loss for the organization. So this is why sometimes companies monitor phone calls, monitor emails to ensure that companies' secrets and confidential data are being protected. Remember, we are still talking about control. So we have talked about financial controls, we have talked about privacy, we have talked about, benchmarking. So we also must talk about employee theft. This is a big problem in all types of organizations, and this is something that needs to be monitored and controlled. And this is why this term is mentioned in this particular chapter. So let's first determine what we mean by employee theft. Employee theft is any unauthorized taking of company property and using it for personal reasons. What we mean by this, this could range from embezzlement, from basically stealing money from the organization, and this is very obvious, very straightforward, but other forms of theft also exist, and people sometimes become a little bit lenient when it comes to thinking about them. When you use the company's printer to, print personal photos, this is considered employee theft. Why? Because you are using the company property not for work reasons, but for personal reasons. So this is what we mean. This is what we mean by saying that employee theft is a big issue, because it takes so many forms. The reason why you are here in the company, location, you are here being paid, some money from 7 o'clock to 4 o'clock to do work for the company. You are not here to read the newspaper. You are not here to, watch YouTube videos, and you are not here to use the company's phone to talk to your friends and family. And you are definitely not here to steal office supplies. When people take, papers and pens and pencils back to their homes, this is employee theft, because this is not your property. This is the company's property, and you were given these supplies to do some work activities. So managers and decision makers must, educate themselves and their employees about employee theft, and they must have procedures in place to prevent this problem. So here are some suggestions of what managers and decision makers and organizations can do to control employee theft. Remember, we had discussed 3 types of controls. For feedforward, this is before the problem occurs, when we are trying to prevent it even from happening. And then concurrent controls, this is as the problem occurs. And then feedback controls, this is after the issue has taken place and we are trying to take corrective actions. So in the problem of employee theft, something that we can do before it even happens is that we can use better hiring criteria. So the people that we select, they must be honest people and people who are trustworthy. And also, we need to establish policies defining theft and disciplining procedures as well. And we need to communicate this to employees openly. We need to also involve employees in writing those policies so that we educate them, so that we raise their awareness about the issue. And then we need to, educate employees and train them about these policies so that they really understand what they mean and why they have been put in place, and what are the effects of employee theft on the organization. And then we need to have a professional review of our security controls, meaning we need to have a regular type of activity where we ongoingly revise our procedures. Now, in terms of concurrent controls, we need to treat employees with respect and dignity first, so that they don't, try to punish us by stealing from the organization. We need to communicate openly with them about the costs of stealing. We need to let employees know on a regular basis about their success in preventing theft and fraud. We need to tell them that because of your efforts, you have saved the company a lot of money. And these things also need to be rewarded. We need to use video surveillance of equipment if conditions are permissible, meaning this is why you will see in all types of stores, if you go to Burger King, if you go to Jarir, you will find that sign that CCTV is being used, meaning that everything is being monitored using cameras, because when employees know that they are being monitored, they will be less encouraged to commit any theft. And then feedback control. So this is after the problem has happened. This is when we need to, impose penalties and punishments. This is when we need sometimes to look back at our control measures and see whether or not we need to revise them. And this is when we need to also make sure that, we set good examples for our employees first. So managers act as role models, and they need to show this type of honest behavior so that employees can imitate them and follow their lead. Another important thing that must be rigorously controlled is workplace violence. So it's a huge problem for organizations because it threatens threatens the safety and the well-being of its employees. And we mentioned that one of the reasons for control, and one of the reasons why control is very important, is that we need to protect our employees against any possible threats. So workplace violence is an increasing problem, unfortunately, in today's businesses. And even though what you see right now on the slide is relevant to the US, it's a common problem across the world. So, and violence takes a number of different forms. It doesn't necessarily always have to be physical violence, where people are just throwing punches at each other or screaming at each other. Violence can be emotional as well. Violence can be psychological, things like bullying. This is also considered violence. So procedures must be in place to protect employees from such a problem. We go back to our feedforward, concurrent, and feedback controls. So we need to set procedures in place to prevent this from happening. That's number one. And then as the problem occurs, we need to address it strongly. And then after the problem has taken place, we need to punish those who have committed this violation. So violence is a big problem. It needs to be addressed strongly, because we are responsible, and we need to protect the safety and well-being of our employees. So here are some suggestions for how managers can control workplace violence. Now, of course, we need to, understand what are some of the reasons, that violence occurs. Violence occurs, unfortunately, because of employee stress, when employees sometimes feel that they are being pushed beyond their limits, when, long working hours, when they feel that they are being treated unfairly by their employers, and so on, when there are any good conflict resolution procedures in place. So you let some of these problems get bigger, and when you do not address them seriously, it could manifest in the form of violence. So again, to address any issue, we can use feedforward, concurrent, and feedback controls. So lots of things that can go on using MBWA, management by walking around. So you can identify potential problems, observe how employees treat each other, and how supervisors in particular treat their supervisees. And we need to have also careful pre-hiring screening, so that we try to detect before we hire someone, is this someone who can work well and get along with others, or can we detect that this is a person who can commit such violations? And lots of other things that take place as the problem occurs and after the problem has happened. Violence needs to be addressed strongly and seriously, and it must be punished in a way that sends a message to the rest of the company that the safety and well-being of our employees come first. So how can managers measure the relationship between the goals and the outcomes when it comes to customers? Remember, customers were part of the balanced scorecard. So we have discussed people, we have discussed financial ratios, we have discussed internal processes. So let's talk a little about customers. So we have goals, in terms of customers, and then we have outcomes that we want to achieve. So how do we establish that relationship, and how can we control for this aspect, for these interactions particularly? We depend, when it comes to our profits, we depend on our customers. These are the ones who are going to pay us money. They are the ones that we need so that we can make money, so that we can make profits. So this is where the concept of service profit chain comes into play. So service profit chain is the service sequence from employees to customers to profit. Let's break it down. So this concept says that how productive our employees are going to be when it comes to serving our customers depend on the company's strategy, depend on the company's delivery system, and so on. And based on these types of things, employees are going to be more effective. They are going to perform better when it comes to serving these customers and interacting very well with them. And as a result of that, the outcome of that is going to be more profits generated. So service profit chain, from the name itself, it's a chain, it's a sequence of related activities. It starts, from the employees, and then it shifts to the customers, and until finally we generate profits. So customers are an important aspect of of organizations, and organizations depend on customers for generating profits. And to keep those customers satisfied and to keep them happy and to even gain more customers, our employees who work in customer service, who deliver the services to our customers and deliver those goods to our customers, they need to be effective. They need to perform well. This performance of them is influenced by the company's strategy, delivery system, and so on. The last concept that we will discuss in today's chapter is corporate governance. Corporate governance. So it's a system that governs corporations. So what does that mean? So what's a corporation? It's a business, it's a firm, it's the company. So we need to have a system in place that controls the entire organization. For which purpose? So that the interests of the owners, of the shareholders, are protected. So this is the reality of the situation. In a company like SABIC, we have owners, people who own shares and stocks in SABIC, and then we have managers and people who run the day-to-day operations. The owners of SABIC, they do not work at SABIC, meaning that they are trusting these managers, trusting these decision makers to actually make the right decisions and to make decisions that are going to be in the best interests of the owners. Unfortunately, sometimes there are conflicts between the interests of the managers and the interests of the owners. Sometimes managers want to spend more money because this is going to improve their reputation, or they want to, make more expenses in terms of salaries. But this is not in the best interest of the owners or the shareholders. So this is why we needed some sort of system that controls this issue, that governs the relationship between the owners of the business, the shareholders of the business, and the people who actually run it on a day-to-day basis. And lots of countries have now developed laws and regulations about corporate governance, and it's a very big field at the moment, and it has become a national requirement here at Saudi Arabia that each and every organization, especially publicly traded ones that have stocks and shares in the market, they must have a corporate governance system in place. So this was our chapter for today. Thank you so much for listening. It was an interesting chapter, and I hope that it has provided you with a good understanding now of the managerial function of controlling. Thank you very much, and I'll see you on future chapters.